Okay. The neurons are arranged in mini columns. And the mini columns, and the structure of mini column is that there's a bunch of layer 5 apical dendrites and a bunch which are kind of clustered in the center, and then around that are a bunch of layer 2 and 3 apical pyramidal cells. So there's pyramidal cells in layer 5 and then pyramidal cells in 2 and 3. And those form a kind of cluster which is called a mini column. And the mini columns are sensitive to specific aspects of the perceptual field if we're talking about perception. And so, for example, a mini column and a cluster of mini columns in a column, 100 mini columns make a column, those are all sensitive to vertical lines in the visual field, and these other ones are next to them are horizontal lines, sensitive to horizontal lines. Okay, now what happens, and this is the, well, before we get to the theory, the last bit of background, that impulses from one midi column, from the 2 and 3s, go to, are passed on to, from one midi column to another, to another, to another, and they go from layer 2-3 to layer 4, and then up to layer 2-3 in the next mini column, and those go on to something else. And this is the process that further refines the signal and analyzes the signal so that some parts of your visual cortex see color, and some parts see motion, and some parts see lines, and so on. All right, so this is our hypothesis. Here's how it might work. First of all, go back. The gray matter is where all of the neural activity associated with consciousness is concentrated. The apical dendrites have these unique structure, which is linear structure. The apical dendrites, which are pyramidal cells, have these apical dendrites which are perpendicular to the cortical surface, and the dendrites terminate in intertwined dendritic tufts in layer 1. So this suggests, and by the way, this is throughout the brain, including the parts that are associated with memory. And I should say throughout the cortex, the neocortex. And so the interface with the mind must be at this cortical surface. And by the way, the function of the apical dendrites is unknown. I mean, yes, they receive impulses, but why are they long and perpendicular? And so particularly, interfacing, the mind must be interfacing with layer 2 and 3 and layer 5, because those are the ones that end in the surface. And probably the interface is in layer 1. All right, so how would it work? Well, another researcher, traditional neuroscience researcher, noticed that there was association with attention, which is a conscious activity, and what was happening in these apical dendrites. At least he suggested that there could be oscillations of pulses in the apical dendrites. And now he wasn't talking about the mind or the interface with the mind, but that resonated with us as a place where the mind could be, and that's what the mind could be doing with, if you remember, oscillating dipoles. So the oscillating dipoles of the mind could be inducing oscillations in the apical dendrite, which would then fire the cell. Likewise, when a cell does fire, it produces what's called a back propagation of action potential, which is measured, and that's an accepted phenomenon. That oscillation could also could influence the mind to have its own oscillatory response. It would induce perceptual elements. So with that in mind, here's how perception would work. That you would have these, this path of, as what you're perceiving passes through the occipital lobe up to this part of the parietal lobe and to the temporal lobes, and is further and further refined, and all of a sudden, if it's long enough, the interaction is long enough, you see something. You see color, and then you see and you recognize a tree. Well, all of those perceptual elements could be transferred through these oscillations to the mind. Now, if you pay attention, the attention could be working on the layer 5 pyramidal cells, which would then have oscillations in them and induce action potentials which would increase the oscillations that are coming up to the mind here in layer 2 and 3. And so you would have amplified perception. And finally, of course, there's the other side. If we have volition, we choose to do something, we think about doing something, we intend to do something, we have a thought, we imagine something, then that could produce, in the right places of the cortex, produce oscillations in layer 5 pyramidal cells, which would then induce, well, first of all, it would induce whatever you're trying to do, motor movement or directed attention or having a thought. But if you're having a thought, it might induce directly, many columns in its column, its area, and you would have the awareness of your thought or intention. So that is the hypothesis. Now we have two observations. One is that we're proposing that there's a second form of neural activity in addition to action potentials. Neuroscientists, the only thing neurons do is they receive these impulses and produce action potentials. We're saying they receive those, that all happens, yeah, that's right, but there also is the connection with the mind where there are the oscillations of the mind inducing the oscillations in the apical dendrites, and that's also happening. And that requires energy. And therefore, there would need to be more energy than you would expect just from the energy required for the action potentials. And the evidence supports that. If you focus attention, if you're measuring it in a monkey and you train the monkey to focus its attention on one part of the visual field, and you measure the blood flow in that part of the, and the action potentials in that part of the brain, you will find that there is more blood flow and more energy than would be needed just for the action potentials. The action potentials increase only mildly in the visual cortex, but the blood flow increases a lot, and it's sustained when there's attention, much more than would be required just for the action potentials. So that's supporting evidence. And we also propose that memory is stored in the field of the mind, where episodic memory, what did you have for dinner, and where did you go shopping, and so on. Those are episodes in your experience, and they're stored in the mind. What facilitates this are the pyramidal neurons in the hippocampus. And so memory formation, as experiences occur, all of the components of that experience from all different parts of your brain are all funneled into the hippocampus. And those induce memories in your mind. And there's also a process of consolidating memories so that they're there kind of permanently. And then for memory recall, the hippocampal cells interface with the mind, and so the mind, you're somehow, through your intention, you're bringing these memories back into the hippocampus. They induce the exact same pathways in your brain and reactivate the same sensory and mental neural components, but usually at a lower intensity. So that is how memory would work. All right, so getting on to after effects. How does this model relate to NDE after effects? All right, the common NDE, there are many, many, many after effects, but the ones that we're interested in our research are the increased sensitivity, light, loud sounds, touch, and electricity, the interference with electronic equipment and watches and clocks, generating unusual electric sparks, elevated psychological dissociation absorption, and psychic and intuitive paranormal abilities. So after an NDE, the mind, of course, is separated from the body. When it comes back, we think what is happening is that the mind is not as tightly unified with the brain and body as it was before. And it extends further beyond the physical body than it did before. Usually, most people feel that they're in their body and that's it. That's non-NDEers. NDEers feel differently. In any case, the mind because it's out here, it can interact with the physical environment. And because your mind and your perceptions, you have perceptions out of body which don't involve the brain at all, then you could have components of your perception that are NDE-like. So one NDE has described to us 3 states. One is body-focused. It doesn't occur that often. She doesn't like feeling that way very much. Then partially expanded, where the field of her mind, this is our speculation, extends beyond her body. And then what she called completely expanded, it's something like being back in the NDE. And we draw it this way. We don't know how big it is. And when she's there and she's interacting with somebody, talking to somebody, it's hard for her to find words when she's in that state, and it's hard for her to remember the details of what happened in that state. But is in this state that she sees unusual things, paranormal things, and so it is a definite experience, and she feels the difference. She feels those different states. All right, in the partially expanded state, how would this work? Well, the sense is if you're expanded out some or a lot, then your physical senses you're getting that still, but you're also getting direct NDE-like senses. You're seeing something, but you're seeing it here, and you're seeing it out here as you would be in the NDE. And that kind of interaction is going to give you a higher sensitivity. The mind's energetic field, if it's out here, can interact with objects electrically and in other ways, and that would give you the interference with electronics, with these unusual sparks, and psychokinetic PK effects. And the mind has direct NDE-like access to thoughts, insights, and images, something like what you would get, telepathy and so on, but even just intuitions, and this would allow you to have, you would exhibit increased psychological dissociation, not clinical dissociation, but more absorption, daydreaming, and having intuitions. And in the completely expanded state, the mind has direct NDE-like access to non-local, what some researchers call non-local aspects of reality, which are precognitive intuitions, seeing ghosts, and things like that. And so that would explain the enhanced psychic, intuitive, and paranormal abilities. Okay, 10 minutes. Pim Van Lommel, well, all right, so we're going to go on to another question here. 5 minutes. Okay. Pim Van Lommel has proposed that consciousness is non-local. And what he calls non-locality is that it operates outside of space and time. And the evidence that he cites, the non-local aspects of NDEs, like life reviews that involve knowledge of other people's experiences. When you do something, in the life review, you feel what you did to them, what they felt. You didn't know that before the life review. Where did you get that knowledge? It's this kind of situation. Knowledge of future events, unconditional love and acceptance, contact with the universal knowledge and wisdom. Now, his idea is that because of this non-locality, then our consciousness really isn't localized anywhere. And it could be, it's not anywhere, it could be not even in the brain,